All right, and we are live. So we are underway here at the Naval War College Museum. Going to give this just a few seconds to allow people to show up and get in and start watching. We're preparing to set out here on the third entry in our series of live online wargaming demonstrations. So we'll just wait for a few more people to show up and get underway. All right, looks like we're starting to get a crowd here. So I think we're going to go ahead and start our program. This is a live program, of course. This is also a video that's going to be available on the Naval War College Museum Facebook, as well as our YouTube page. So for anybody watching, if you have to leave, if you show up in the middle of this and want to see what happened outside the time you were watching, you can watch this as a recording after the fact. So this will be available for you to watch at any time on the Naval War College Museum Facebook and YouTube. But welcome to everybody who's watching. My name is Rob Doan. I'm the curator for the Naval War College Museum. And we are getting set to do the third installment in our War Games series. Tonight, it's going to be us, the National War College Museum, versus the National Museum of the U.S. Army in a game that is focused on the very end of the Guadalcanal campaign in World War II. And we have, in addition to myself, we have a couple other people joining us tonight, including my opponent for tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the other people who will be joining us, starting off with AJ. AJ Orlikoff is the Education Specialist Lead for the National Museum of the U.S. Army. He's a native of Hampton Roads, Virginia. He attended Old Dominion University, where he earned a bachelor's and master's degree in history, specializing in the American Civil War as well as the history of imperialism. Following graduation, AJ also worked as an educator at Hampton Roads Naval Museum before accepting his current position at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. And AJ, we need to talk about that, as a matter of fact.
Oh, is that so? Is that because, I personally believe, just a personal opinion of mine, is go Army, beat Navy, and wait, that's a fact. It's going to happen.
We'll see. We'll see what happens by the end of this game. AJ has also interned with Richmond National Battlefield Park and has contributed a chapter on the military history of Norfolk in the upcoming publication, A History Lover's Guide to Norfolk. And tonight he's going to be the American player in our game while I control the Japanese. So welcome, AJ. We also have tonight Mark Stanovich, who is an associate professor with the Wargaming Department at the Naval War College. Mark is a retired Marine Corps officer who holds a bachelor's degree in history from Holy Cross, as well as a master's degree in history from Norwich University. During his military career, he was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal, the Iraq Campaign Medal with 2 stars, Combat Action Ribbon, the Navy Marine Corps Unit Commendation, as well as the Purple Heart. With over 20 years of gaming experience, his expertise includes building and conducting war games that focus on cybersecurity, medical and emergency response, supply chain interruption, weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, diplomacy, as well as traditional military conflict. So thank you, Mark, for joining us tonight.
Greetings, everyone.
So if you have watched either of our earlier 2 programs, we did 2 of these last year in the spring and summer, you know a little bit about what this is about. But basically, during this time that we've been closed, we're trying to present a little bit of what goes on at the Naval War College and what we have in our museum that relates to what is taught at the college. One of the subjects we get asked about more than anything else is wargaming. It's a subject that people are very interested in. They always want to know what kinds of games are played at the War College in terms of the professional gaming for officers. And it's something that we would love to be able to show our audience, but we can't because those games are not open to the public. So for us, the next best thing is to take a commercially available game like the one that we're going to be using tonight and play it out and give a chance to talk about strategy, tactics, operations, the kinds of things that students at the college learn, and also talk about how it is or is not similar to professional wargaming. And that's an area where Mark is really going to be able to help us out tonight. So I'm looking forward to this. Unlike the first two games that we did, this one tonight is a commercial war game called Order of Battle. It's a computer war game. It is an operational level game, which is not what we did in our first two games. Those were much more lower level, kind of tactical in nature. But this one is a step up in terms of the level and the scale and the scope of what we're going to be fighting over tonight. And I should start out by saying that although this is a commercially available game, you should not consider this any kind of endorsement by the US government. We are using this just as a platform to host this educational program tonight. But this game does have some similarities with games that go on at the college, and we'll get into that. So I want to go through right now, and before we get into the game itself, give just a brief historical background so we can kind of set the table here for what's going on in our game. So the scenario that we're playing tonight is taking place at the very end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943. How we got here, of course, this map here is showing you the situation at the height of Japanese expansion in the Pacific during the war. So we're looking here at the summer of 1942. The Battle of Midway, of course, is the marquee event where the U.S. Achieves a decisive victory over the Japanese Navy, and that becomes the high water mark for the rest of the war. The Japanese are on the strategic defensive. It doesn't mean that they're not still attacking, counterattacking where they can, trying to launch limited offensives, but they're at the strategic level. They're just trying to maintain what they have from that point forward. So down here in the corner, I'll use my mouse pointer here. So here's Guadalcanal and the Solomons. After Midway, the question is, what to do next? Where should the American offensive throw itself at? If you know anything about the U.S. war effort in the Pacific, you know that inter-service rivalry plays quite a determining factor in U.S. strategy. It's something we kind of laugh about, joke about, have a good time with, especially around the Army-Navy football game. But in World War II, it was really a deadly serious subject because it had real implications for strategy on both sides of the war. For the U.S., the question that kind of handled at the Joint Chiefs level is what should the main target of this first U.S. offensive be after Midway? And the target they identified was up here in the Solomons. I'm pointing to here on the island of New Britain, the main Japanese base in Rabaul. This is the largest Japanese fleet base in the South Pacific and is going to be a key target that has to either be taken or neutralized in some way on the advance to the Western Pacific to get in range of Japan itself. Before you can get there, the Japanese also have a number of bases here in the Solomon Islands chain. And that's what's bringing us to the island of Guadalcanal, because that's one of them. So before you can even get close enough to attack Rabaul, you kind of have to do this stepping stone, the island hopping campaign that we all know and are familiar with. That's going to kind of begin here on the island of Guadalcanal. So the initial invasion occurs in August of 1942. And you can see here all the campaign arrows showing the fighting on land here. It turns into a 5-month campaign that is mostly centered around trying to control this key airfield right in the middle here, Henderson Field. And although the initial invasion goes pretty well, it's a story here of the troops being able to wade ashore and expecting heavy fighting on the beaches, but not really finding it. That comes later. The Japanese do what they come to learn to do very well in this war, which is not fight on the beaches, but kind of withdraw inland and make the American advance a very slow, very tedious affair, and make them really earn every inch of ground that they take along the way. So at this point, I want to hand this off to AJ, since AJ is the Army expert here, and he's going to talk a little bit about the Army's role in this campaign and the units that were involved. So AJ, over to you.
Sure. Well, at this juncture in the battle, as you said, the Marines come ashore, they take Henderson Field, they establish their perimeter, but they're not really significantly challenged by the Japanese on the ground until later on in the campaign. But they are at sea. The Navy is going to lose several battles in what becomes known as Iron Bottom Sound. You can see that. You can see it's in between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. And these battles really take the toll of the Navy. It really disrupts the resupply efforts to the Marines. The Japanese are going to land forces. And what is going to occur over the next few weeks and months, again, as you said, 5 months, is a grinding battle of attrition in some of the roughest terrain on the planet Earth. It really is just a brutal fight. Several attempts, like I said, are made by the Japanese to seize Henderson Field. They are bloodily repulsed by the Marines at Henderson. Meanwhile, the Navy is in a slugfest of their own against the Japanese in Iron Bottom Sound and in the waters around Guadalcanal. There are several naval battles, and this is back and forth seesaw action occurs over the weeks and of September 1942 into October and even into November. And this really culminates in the naval battle of Guadalcanal, and from 12 November to 15 November, where the Americans do score a victory against the Japanese. The Japanese don't want to give up Guadalcanal yet, but eventually by December, leadership is starting to see the writing on the wall. They're not going to be able to stop this American invasion, and they're going to start pivoting to withdrawing from Guadalcanal. And that leads us to the Army, because the Army gets sent in December 1942, basically to take over for the Marines. The Marines are a strike force. They were not designed, they're light infantry. They were not designed to hold the ground, even though they did. They were not designed to do that. That was the Army's job, and they finally get in there in December. And next slide, please. They're under the command of this man. This is Major General Alexander Patch. He commands the 14th Corps. That is the 23rd Infantry Division, the 25th Infantry Division, and actually it's a combined command because he has under his command the 2nd Marine Division. He also has the 147th Infantry Regimental Combat Team and the 13th Air Force providing cover. And he's about 50,000 men and 167 artillery guns of various sizes. So just a little bit about these two. Patch himself, he is a grizzled veteran. He's served decades in the Army. He served in World War I in the 1st Infantry Division. He was a captain. He commanded a machine gun battalion. He fights in the Meuse-Argonne, one of the largest battles ever in American history. And he's in the Army throughout the entire time of the interwar period. He's involved in interwar planning, schooling, etc. And he's still around right there in World War II. He takes command in November 41, and he takes command of a collection of units across the Pacific. They're sort of patched together, really, across garrison units across the Pacific. He himself is very in contrast to other Army generals in World War II. Certainly much more reserved than men like MacArthur and Patton. He is very quiet. He's unassuming, but he's loved by his men, and he has this quiet confidence about him that he knows he can get the job done. A little bit about these two divisions that are here, if you would, next slide, please. One is the 23rd Division, or as it was known then, the Americal Division. It's actually one of the only of two divisions to ever be Army divisions to ever be known by a name as opposed to a number. And they were formed from Task Force 6814, which is a collection of garrison units across the Pacific. They get the name Americal because they're initially designated, they're based on the island of New Caledonia. And so because they are based on, they're based in New Caledonia, Patch comes up with the phrase Americal, combining American with Caledonia and creating sort of that new name for them. They're the only division to not be formed in the U.S., and they are expert jungle fighters. They are joined in this conflict by the 25th Infantry Division. If you would, next slide. That is Tropic Lightning, and as you see, of course,
I don't know how that got there. I'm so sorry.
Okay, well, we'll don't worry, everyone. We'll see about that in just a few moments when I kick Rob's butt. But the 25th Division, Tropic Lightning, they're in a very similar situation. They're actually garrison units in Hawaii mostly, and their barracks is attacked on Pearl Harbor. Schofield Barracks is attacked on Pearl Harbor. So they are right there at the beginning of the war. They actually trained for a year before deploying to Guadalcanal. Again, they're trained in jungle fighting. They're trained for this fight. But like the 23rd, they are very green and inexperienced. And so both of these units are going to be at Patch's disposal, as well as another division incorporating some of those Marine units, and they're known as the CAM Division, and that consists of the 147th Regimental Regiment. They're an independent command, the 182nd Regiment from the Americal Division, and the 6th Marine Regiment. And these are going to be some of the units that I will have at my disposal as a player, trying to take the fight to the Japanese.
Excellent. Okay. So you've got the Army side of it here. The scenario that we're playing tonight, again, as I said, it's going to begin in February of 1943. At the end of this campaign, so the main Japanese command that's responsible for Guadalcanal is the Japanese 17th Army. At the beginning of the campaign, they start out with more than 30,000 troops. By the time that our scenario is taking place here, at the end of the campaign, they've been whittled down to somewhere around 11,000. So it's really about a division-sized element, and that's all that's left. They reluctantly decide that they need to evacuate the remainder of this army, try and save it to at least allow it to fight another day. So in January of 1943, they launch a very limited campaign to try and establish at least air superiority over the very tip of Cape Esperance here, which is where their main evacuation site is going to be, and allow that evacuation to take place. On the U.S. Navy side of it, Admiral William Halsey is the senior naval commander who's responsible for the South Pacific. He is a Naval War College graduate in the class of 1933. He took over this command just in October of the previous year, and he did have a sizable force that was available under his command. 2 fleet carriers, the Enterprise and Saratoga, 6 escort carriers, 3 fast battleships, 4 old battleships, 13 cruisers, and 45 destroyers. So a significant force. The main story in this part of the campaign, and the one that historians kind of latch on, is the misreading of the signals and the intelligence that was gained on this. So from reconnaissance flights, from intercepted radio traffic, the Americans did figure out that there was an operation being planned and being executed here in February and late January. But they misinterpreted what it was about. They believed that, in fact, the Japanese were reinforcing the island and preparing to launch a major counterattack to try and retake Henderson Field and secure the island once again. And they just did not realize what the true nature of this operation was. So this is a thing that Halsey sometimes comes into criticism for. He's somebody who's known as being very aggressive, not somebody you would think would be cautious. In this case, he did hold these naval units away from Guadalcanal to the south to try and protect some of these American troop transports that were up bringing reinforcements. So in the actual battle, these naval forces on both sides did not come to blows. And in fact, the evacuation operation was a success for the Japanese. They were able to get the remnants of their army off the island, and they did, in fact, withdraw, where they were able to continue fighting the war later on in other places. So that is the historical background of what is going on for us tonight. We're going to watch into the game here, so I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to go over to the game screen so we can launch into that, and I'll tell you what's going on with going to share my green game screen. All right, and there we are. All right, AJ, if you go onto your end into this screen here, I think you should have the option to go ahead and launch the game.
I'm launching now.
So the scenario that we're playing tonight, I'm describing as a half historical and half hypothetical game. The ground portion of this game is going to be pretty much the historical situation, where the remnants of the Japanese army are trying to get off, and the Japanese evacuate them. What we are doing differently is that we are placing these naval forces that were in the theater and could have taken part into this game. So we're going to have a much more potential for a naval clash than actually happened in reality. And I'm going to switch over to AJ's screen. There we are. So here's the setup for our game. And AJ, do you want to just talk a little bit about what we're seeing here and the forces that you have under your command?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll start with the Army forces here. As I mentioned before, there were several divisions that were here, but the units that are actually engaged in this battle are going to be the CAM division, which is that composite Marine and Army division that I mentioned before. They're supported by some artillery here on the road. And if I actually start, I can mouse over the units to show you. We have the 6th Marine Regiment here from the CAN Division, supported by the 182nd Infantry Regiment, as well as the 147th Infantry Regiment. We also have the 25th Division over here on my left flank. You see the 161st, the 35th Regiment, and the 27th. As you see over here, we actually have some forces that have come in and done a small invasion of the other side of the island here to actually cut off any retreating Japanese soldiers. And again, the Japanese are trying to withdraw their forces from Cape Esperance right here. And it is my goal as a player, and it's the goal of these Army forces, to try to catch up with these Japanese units and destroy them. As you see, I also have some naval assets available. Again, these are Halsey's forces. I have they would not have been this close, as Rob was saying, but they were in theater, and if Halsey had wanted to, he could have brought these forces to bear. So we have some PT boats here supporting, but then you see we have the main American fleet right here. We have the carriers, USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga. They each have a squadron of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. We also have battleships here. You see we have North Carolina, the Washington, USS Indiana, and then you see we also have cruiser support and a destroyer screen. Now, as far as to how these units are represented in this game, the carriers, the larger ships, the larger capital ships are represented on a 1-to-1 ratio. But with the destroyers, and then obviously with our Army units here, there is a little bit of representation going on of like what's actually happening. So, yep, that is my American forces. And Rob, I'm going to pass it back to you do you want to? Oh, I guess you'll go over the Japanese on your turn.
I will, yeah. If you want to go ahead and start moving, I'll just say a little bit more about the game itself.
All right, sure. I do have a question for chat because I will move my Army forces first. When I take these carriers into the air, would chat like me to arm my Avenger bombers with torpedoes to go after ships, or I can switch them to bombs to go after fleeing infantry units on the road? I'll ask someone in chat to make that decision. Think about it.
Yeah,
wait till I get done.
This will be we want to encourage a lot of comments on Facebook and YouTube. So if you're watching and you've got suggestions for strategy here, we'd absolutely love to get those, and we'll see what we can do to implement them. But you can see
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, as AJ's moving around. So this is a hex-based map that's governing where the units are moving to. The overall objectives here, just so you know what we're trying to do, we've set up the victory conditions such that for the Japanese to win, they need to do one of two things. Either they need to get 4 of the 5 ground units that they begin the game with, get them to survive to the end of the game. And they can do that by either withdrawing into the island and surviving, or getting off the island and being evacuated on the Japanese ships. So if they do that, they win. Or if they sink an American aircraft carrier or battleship, either their capital ships, if they can do that, then they can win also, regardless of what happens to their troops on land. For the US player, AJ's objective is to stop me from rescuing. He needs to destroy all 5 of those units that he's going to run into here down the road. So if he does not do that, he's not going to achieve his objectives. There is a slight possibility neither of us will achieve that. And if that happens, then we can just do what wargamers do and argue about who won. But we'll see what happens down the road.
In any case, a tie, let it be known now, it will be a victory for the Americans. All right, so I think I'm going to soften up this unit with some artillery before I attack it.
Mark, we talked a little bit earlier about the role of wargaming at the college during the interwar period and how that relates to what we're going to see here tonight. I think one of the common themes when we talk about gaming is kind of the role that the games at the college played in helping people figure out strategy in terms of what they call the thruster or through ticket strategy versus the cautionary strategy that leads to that island hopping campaign. Can you talk just a little bit about those strategies and how the games at the college influence them?
Certainly. One of the misnomers about the interwar period, which is generally considered to be the heyday of wargaming, is that the whole Pacific War was basically figured out at the War College, and the rest of the intellectual debate was about how to execute what they'd learned at the War College. That is not necessarily the case. The War College games helped a great deal, but they helped almost indirectly. They were part of the student curriculum, in which the students practiced orders writing, clear and concise expression of intent, and practiced the estimate of the situation. In doing so, they had very highly detailed rule sets for which the umpiring took a great deal of time. Often 3 minutes of combat would take 30 to 45 minutes to adjudicate, but the Navy believed it was worthwhile because these were student games, and the learning was being done literally at the edge of the game board. Norman Friedman, in his book and in his series of lectures, really puts it well when he says the war games didn't give you war plan orange, but they did teach mid-rank Navy and Marine Corps officers how to fight this new Navy, a Navy with airplanes, a Navy with submarines, a Navy with aircraft carriers, with very fast cruisers. And in that way, they both fed and were fed by the various fleet problems that were done throughout the interwar years that Al Murphy wrote so eloquently about. And they fed a lot of the Marine Corps experiments regarding power projection. It was pretty obvious we were going to have to project power at least onto islands. So the games at the college, while they didn't solve the problems of a Pacific War, they did allow for a common experiential framework. And they allowed the players that played them, the Ernie Kings, the Nimitzes, the Halseys, Mitcher was at the War College, a lot of the very familiar names. It allowed them to develop the habits of mind of what a Pacific War was going to take. And in that way, it indirectly affected whether or not we were going to have a thruster strategy or a different approach to things. As weapons and technologies developed, it was pretty clear that a U.S. fleet that set out from Pearl Harbor to relieve Manila would probably be pretty badly damaged by the time it got there. So in that way, the war games did indeed shape the strategy, but they shaped it rather indirectly. They allowed the naval leadership to see where the kinds of thinking that they had to do strategically and operationally were going to be either successful or really a dead end.
Great. Yeah, we are going over to my turn now after AJ's finished his turn. One important thing to note about this game is that you all in the audience are seeing what we're doing, but me and AJ, cannot necessarily see the same thing. One of the great things about this game that it implements is fog of war. So even though you all can see AJ's ships out there on the water when he sees them, when I'm looking at it here on my screen, I'm not going to see anything that my units in the game actually wouldn't see in real life. I've got to make contact with his forces in order to actually know where they are. So as we live stream this, AJ and I have kind of a gentleman's agreement to not watch the feed so that we can maintain that mystery and suspense and not exactly know what's going on. At the start of the turn, as you just saw here, it does give you a replay of what happens. So everything that I just clicked through there is what you've already seen on AJ's, but now I'm going to launch into my turn here as the Japanese player. So my main question I'm trying to figure out is what to do and how to get away. And I've got one unit up here in the front that is the battalion that the Japanese landed to be essentially the rear guard and to be a bit of a roadblock. While the 4 units that are behind here, you'll see in the middle here, this number on all of the units that you'll see in our game is a strength number. It goes from 1 to 10. So the closer it goes to 1, the weaker that unit is. You also see these colored circles that are next to that number. You'll see my 4 units back here have a orange circle, which is their noting that they are out of supply. This rear guard unit, because it was a freshly landed unit, is in full supply right now. It's probably not going to stay that way for too long, but at least for now, I'm going to see what I can do here to...
Rob, as you do your turn, it is.
Mhm.
I think it's worth mentioning just again how critically how critical the supply situation was for the Japanese at the time. I know you mentioned it before, but again, just to mention it again, these men are starving. They can barely. They are malnourished. They are disease ridden. They're fighting in the jungle again in hospitable conditions, and the Japanese are having incredible difficulty supplying them to such an extent that they'll only send destroyers down the slot because the threat from the American air it was so high, and they're dropping off barrels full of food, and they're not even landing. They're not even landing supplies. They're dropping barrels off on high speed runs. That's how bad the supply situation is.
Mm-hmm. I saw one of the comments was about the famous Nimitz quote. So Admiral Nimitz is well known for this speech that he gave to the Naval War College student body in 1960, where he's talking about the value of wargaming at the college in the interwar period. And it's a quote I think everybody at the college knows, where he talks about that basically nothing that took place in the war actually surprised the Navy because it had been gamed so many times on the college gaming floor. And the only thing that happened that they didn't anticipate was the kamikaze tactics. That was one thing they had never anticipated, even in wargaming.
Yeah,
Mark, I would be. Yeah, please go ahead and talk, Mark. I'd love to hear your opinion on how.
It's a very interesting quote, and Ryan asks a good question. A lot of people interpret that to sort of forward the myth that wargaming solved all the problems or gave them a roadmap completely from start to finish to victory. What Nimitz is really getting at is that the characteristics of the war in the Pacific wound up being fairly well defined. The requirements for long-range logistics forces, for underway refueling, for forward air bases, for forward maintenance facilities, those kinds of things, the requirement to move naval forces basically under land-based air until they had so much naval air power that they no longer had to. All of those things were logical conclusions from the outcome of a lot of these games. That the types of naval capabilities that the two sides brought to the table, and the different juxtaposition of tactical and operational situations were practiced again and again and again. So there was nothing about the Pacific War and what would be required to win that did come as a surprise to the U.S. Navy. And it's, not just from wargaming. You can see it in our shipbuilding plans. You can see it in how the Marines were practicing their amphibious doctrine. You can see it from the acquisition decisions that were made in the late 1930s when money was very tight. Those war games allowed, along with the fleet problems, along with the Marine Corps experimentation, they allowed the Navy to come to grasp with the very likelihood of the characteristics of the war. And in that way, they got some things that were not necessarily quite correct, but they got an awful lot of it correct. They had the right Navy by and large. They had some problems with fighter aircraft and torpedoes, but they had a lot of it right. And they got it right in large part because war games showed naval leadership at the lieutenant commander, and captain level what the requirements would be to fight the kind of Navy that they were going to have.
Yeah, I think I know I've definitely heard it said and read a lot that the real value of wargaming is as a mental training tool. To give those senior officers practice and going through the decision-making process. And even if it isn't always a perfect predictive tool, it's not to say that the games in the interwar period did predict every single situation that came up. It certainly gave all those senior officers invaluable peacetime practice and going through and having to get just a little taste of the actual decision making process they would have to go through and practice it in a way where you can safely make mistakes and people's lives aren't at risk. So
that actually becomes a really good point, Rob, that war games not only show you what success looks like, they can often show you what failure looks like, what a pilot would call a irreversible and unrecoverable condition, essentially an operational or tactical dead end. And the results of some of the war games and some of the estimates of what enemy capabilities would look like in the 20s and 30s essentially put paid to the thruster strategy. That's one of those examples. The example of requiring forward maintenance capabilities, the famous floating dry docks that were built in the 30s. All of those came from some pretty educated guesses of how or what requirements a Navy fighting on the other side of the world would need. And without them, without the Ulysses and the Euphetes and the floating dry docks and the incredible capability that was brought well forward of Hawaii, the Pacific War would have been a very difficult challenge indeed.
Well, looks like what's going on, Rob? Looks like your Kano battalion decided to run away. I thought they were supposed to be an elite rear guard. Looks like the CAM division kind of got to them.
Yeah, unfortunately, they are definitely on speed bump duty, I would say, even at their have the Japanese army haven't supplied them as best they could. They are bound to live
live. I'm glad this is live. You hear the excuses starting already, folks.
They are bound to live a short but hopefully useful life. So that's my main goal.
Well, I think I looked in chat, and it looked like people seemed to be about equal on whether I should go for torpedoes to prepare for any of your possible ships in the area, or go with bombs to really get a decisive strike. I think I'm going to do both. I will have one up with bombs and one up with torpedoes.
It's the luxury of having a Navy with material superiority, I guess, should we say, as the U.S. Navy does.
That's right. Maybe not with the torpedoes at this time, but overall.
One other, I think I did not mention in the beginning. So this game that we're playing, this scenario, is 12 turns long. Our goal here for tonight, we're going to play until about 9 o'clock for this live session, and we'll see how many turns we get in. I think we'll probably end up getting about 3 or 4 turns total. Our plan is for the middle turns, we're going to play, AJ and I are going to play those out offline, or at least not live here, and we'll record those. We're going to post these as a series of YouTube videos so that everybody who wants to can watch and follow what happens in our game. A month from now, on Thursday, March 18th, we're going to plan to play out the conclusion to this. So we'll see what the situation is by then, but we're going to play out probably about the final 3 turns in another live session, just like with this one, so we can play out the exciting finale, as they say. Mark, I know that there is only so much you can say about modern day professional wargaming at the college, but based on what you've seen from this game so far, the scale, the unit scale, the hex map, can you talk just a little bit about in what ways this game is similar to the games that you run at the college?
I certainly can. All games of this type share some common features. But it's important to remember that the computer game, the likes of which you guys are battling out to the death on, are really designed for entertainment where the focus is on playability. They have a first-person shooter heritage, or a not very many people shooter heritage. I don't know what the maximum number of additional players is, but in a war game, the type that we play, particularly our larger global Title 10 games, we will often have several hundred players. And we will also have a much larger set of forces. We will look at a true operational game where we've got hundreds to thousands of units on the map called pucks, and it will expand over several days to weeks of combat. In doing so, the kinds of engagements that you've got here, there will be potentially tens of thousands of individual weapons engagements. Although some computer modeling and sim can help that, that's actually not the more difficult part to wrestle with. We will often use modeling and sim as our input for a set of engagement or outcome rules. But the real issue that we would have of a game like this is our games lack the very numerous levels of staffing that would take mountains of this data and turn it into useful information for players in order to make decisions, because our games are based around making decisions. Now, that said, there are some commonalities. Some of you guys were involved in the Jutland historical game we did in 2016, and there were some aspects to that rang pretty true with some of the games that we play behind a classified door, in that requirements to be clearly spoken, to issue clear and concise orders that are understood by people that aren't in a room with you, understanding what your tactical and doctrinal requirements are. All those things come in pretty handy. But yeah, our games tend to be almost entirely a lot larger than one that you could reasonably play in a format like this for a very long length of time. So even though they do share some common pedigree, there's obviously moving and shooting. There's sometimes communicating. There's reconnaissance. A lot of those aspects are common to both types of games, really to all types of games after a certain extent. But the real difference would be that these games are built for fun and playability, and ours are rather serious in nature.
Here's a good question. Did the U.S. ever wargame the Japanese using their subs in the Pacific, like the Germans used theirs in the Atlantic?
I don't know of any game that directly addressed that. The Japanese did not have the numbers of submarines, and certainly didn't have the limited water space in which they could concentrate their submarines. The Japanese also, and this is something we had some insight on for a number of reasons, they were not necessarily particularly enamored with attacking merchant shipping. They found it to be dishonorable. They wanted to attack warships because they thought warriors should be battling warriors. And while there is some merit to that argument, because an aircraft carrier is a pretty expensive piece of kit, they would have it displayed to them in pretty stark detail that when we sank just about every tanker they had, suddenly the Achilles heel is not necessarily the American or their own force of warships, but the soft underbelly of merchant shipping was a very lucrative and relatively poorly defended target. We did not wargame that, but the Japanese certainly didn't either. And they were much more vulnerable to anything like that than we ever would have been.
Oh, here's a question about what's the game turn to real-time scale? Yeah, good question. I didn't cover that in the beginning, but we have about 2 turns per day here at this scale. In this game, you can actually change that scale quite a bit. So this is a custom scenario. If you're looking for this scenario, by the way, on the game, this is one that we invented for this program. It's not one that you can download out there, but certainly if anybody is interested in getting it, playing it, you can leave a comment here or contact us offline, and I'll be happy to send that to you.
All right, let's check the damage. Okay, nothing happened. Okay. Oh, the Kano Battalion is brave. They did turn around. So I have another inquiry for our wonderful audience, is that I know Rob is tricky. And speaking of submarines, I know he has some in theater, but I don't know if he's approaching my fleet with it to try to get my carriers. Because remember, he gets a carrier or a battleship, he gets a win. So I have to preserve my carriers just like the Americans did that were there in 1943. So I can either go full steam ahead and just go for his ground forces with shore bombardment. I guess you know that plan now, Rob, but there's not much you could do about it. Or should I be more conservative and try to keep my destroyers back to search for submarines? I'll give the chat a second while I move my army forces.
There's another good question. Did the Japanese underperform when compared to what might have been expected from them in the wargaming experience? Mark, I'll invite you to say something about that too. Just real quickly, in some ways, I think that gets back to the Nimitz quote again. You know, when he is talking about nothing in the war surprised the U.S. Clearly, that's a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, it does begin with Pearl Harbor, obviously, which was a surprise. So it's not that the war games revealed every single step along the way, although a lot of the games did, in fact, begin with surprise attacks like that. But most of the games that I know of, and Mark, you've probably seen the reports more than I have, but some of the things are things like they did not use, as I think we were just talking about submarines, they didn't use submarines in quite as much of the commerce rating role in the games as they did in the actual war. Amphibious landings, certainly did not play quite as large a role and were not as big and complex as the actual historical operations turned out to be. What would you say in terms of actual Japanese performance as opposed to how they did in the actual games at the college in the 30s?
Well, it's a very complex question. You could probably teach a semester on it, but it's a great question from Luke. They overperformed in some ways at the tactical level. They had very good ships. If you've ever read the Japanese, the sort of the definitive book on the Japanese Navy, Kaigun, they had very good ships. They obviously had very good airplanes, particularly at the outset of the war. The naval pilots in Kido Butai were the best in the world by a fairly wide margin. They also had excellent cruisers and excellent destroyers. The Type 93 torpedo was a trump card that we had very little awareness of, even though we probably should have. And that includes even up to the point where these guys are playing this game, the true capabilities of the Type 93 and how the Japanese used it were a little bit of a mystery to the United States Navy. We were looking for submarines left and right when in actuality, the destroyers that were retiring over the horizon had fired the long-range torpedoes that had such devastating effect at Tassafaronga, which was only a few weeks before this happened. Their performance was probably comparable to what we thought they would do overall at the high tactical, low operational level. Where they probably underperformed, whether it's in a war game construct and overall, is their operational planning was wildly complex and often so interdependent that a single failure could bring the operation to sort of a disastrous end. And we saw that happen more than a few times with the Japanese. But the other piece to this is a lot of what I'm saying here wasn't known literally until after the war, until there was interrogation of Japanese prisoners and a strategic bombing survey. They were a fearsome naval opponent. They were very well trained. They were very good at gunnery. They had superb skills fighting at night. They had unmatched naval aviation, especially at the beginning of the war. A lot of people will turn to Midway as being the turning point of the war. I might make the argument that really it was much less of a sharp point, and it was the Solomons campaign. It was a real turning point, because following that, they were on a downward trajectory that they could never get out of. After Santa Cruz, actually, mathematically, there was very little chance they had of winning the war, bringing the war to a successful conclusion. So their performance, in comparison to how we thought they would perform in the war games, was probably comparable at the tactical level, which was what we were really war gaming. At the higher levels in the intelligence estimates, that may not be the same, and I haven't looked at that in some detail, but tactically they were at least as good as we thought they were.
So I'm continuing to move here. You may have seen, if you're watching on my screen while I'm moving, that there's a large chunk of the Japanese fleet in this scenario that does not begin on the map. All of the American fleet, what AJ is controlling, does. So everything that he has, he's starting with on map. What we're postulating here is that if the Americans had committed more to this battle than they actually did, then the Japanese would have likewise. And they've got a number of different directions that they theoretically could have entered Iron Bottom Sound from here. So they begin off map. If you've been watching, you've been seeing that I am bringing in some of those reinforcements. I don't think that's going to give away too much to AJ to let him know that they are coming. It's
Right.
a question of where.
Yes, and so I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I was I'm saying that at the college, so there's one of the schools, one of the departments at the college that teaches operational planning. If they were looking at a scenario like this, one of these concepts that people in the military deal with all the time is the principles of war. If you're a military veteran, you've almost certainly encountered them. If you're an officer, especially involved with planning. There are now, when I was in, there were 9 principles. Now I've learned there are 12, so they've expanded over the years. But a couple of them that I think are coming into play, especially for me, are maneuver and simplicity. And I can tell you I'm mostly obeying one of those and mostly violating another one. So I'll leave it to you to guess which is which. But I'm got a number of things that I'm trying to do here to set up what I think will set us up for success and not give too much away to you in the process, AJ.
Yeah, one of the big things the American player has to worry about in this scenario is the Japanese can, just like they could have in the real, and really in 1943, is that they could approach from anywhere. There's a lot of waterways in the Solomon Islands. There's a lot of ways they could have approached the U.S. fleet from. So, the American player does have to be very aware of what's going on around them, because the Japanese could attack from anywhere. So you really have to balance how much you go after those infantry units. But I'm going to go ahead and, based on some comments from chat, I'll do a little bit of role playing here. I'll say Halsey was one of his characteristic aggressive moves, and maybe thinks the Japanese Navy is not too much to worry about. I think I'm going to go for those ground units.
Well, that's one of the ways in which this differs from what would have happened in late January, early February 43 is, we historians, we know how things end, right? So working backwards from that gives AJ a bit of an advantage. Halsey had some pretty good reason to not go charging into restricted waters with the only 2 operating aircraft carriers that he had, right? Don't forget, a lot of what we're looking at here is hindsight. We had just had Santa Cruz and the naval battle for Guadalcanal, which was a victory, but we didn't know it was a victory until, in fact, after this, because intelligence didn't put the pieces together. the withdrawal of these forces, the remnants of 2nd and 38th Division, and the landing of what we would consider today to be a battalion task force with a fully equipped battery of mountain guns, is indistinguishable really from a reinforcement. And in the jungle, as you can well imagine, to those of us who've been there, it's a little difficult to see stuff. And the Japanese really executed a deception plan that is much more toward the lines of what the Russians would call maskirovka. It isn't just that they were hiding stuff; they were deceiving with some of their other actions. And the Japanese had, handed us our ass at Tassafaronga, pardon my French, where we had a lot of damage to American warships. Bringing the sizable portions of what's the surviving portions of the U.S. fleet to bear against an unknown entity is not necessarily the thing that would be considered a prudent move without all of the background knowledge that we now know. And Bork Silverholtz makes the comment, the Japanese had a small navy compared to the Allies. Well, right about this time, in the Pacific at least, it's relatively even. Where this becomes the turning point is the United States had more ships building and just being commissioned than the Japanese would ever have. And if they could manage to hold out and not allow the Japanese to sever our lines to Australia, then things were going to be pretty grim for the Japanese. And what played out here was, because the Japanese didn't have the naval capability to resupply the troops on the island, the decision was made to pull them out.
Right. Hindsight really is everything, I think, in this scenario. So the audience may have noticed that my destroyers are actually the only units which can detect robbed submarines. So they actually have an ability where instead of moving, I can do a sonar sweep, which will reveal them if they're within 2 hexes. So if they're submerged, that is the only way I can find them unless they're shooting a torpedo at my fleet. So that's what I have to balance, whether I want to do more sonar sweeps or whether I want to go after these infantry.
We are definitely in a cat and mouse game here, AJ, because our surface units have not really made contact. Well, they have not made contact with each other at all yet. I know you're out there.
Contact.
Oh, have you found something? Okay. We may change soon then here. I would be curious for people who are watching to know some of what AJ is doing, and I don't, of course, but about for the Japanese, for these ground units they have to survive to the end of the turn. And I had said in the beginning, they have 2 ways to do that: either kind of pull back into the interior of the island and sort of live to the end of the turn, which, if that had happened in real life, I guess you would say they would be continuing to at least control the island, or create headaches for the American forces on the island longer than they did historically. So that's why we would call that a win in this scenario. And then the other option, of course, is to just get on the ships, get to the port at the tip of Cape Esperance, and get away to safety. So at this point, I would like to know if people think my 4 Japanese units that are running down the road should make for the ports to try to get on the ships, or withdraw into the interior of the island and go for a fight it out to the end of the game strategy.
It's a good question.
There's another question about if there are any air assets on Henderson Field. So the answer to that, unfortunately, is no. There is an element that we don't have present in this scenario that I made a conscious decision to leave out, which is the land-based air. That probably would have been heavily involved. Definitely would have been heavily involved in a situation like this if this is what had played out. I decided not to leave them out just because of an issue with this game, and looking at how it handles air units. When I was talking in the beginning about how this game, you can scale the time differently. So you can say that one turn represents either an hour, or you can say that a turn represents a couple days. The unfortunate thing for us is that no matter what time scale you choose, it doesn't really scale the aircraft capabilities along with that. And so what that means is if an aircraft can basically stay in the air, I believe it's for something like 10 or 12 turns. But if each turn represents a day, that means that you have aircraft flying for 12 days before they can land. And at this scale, you might say that, we can explain that away by saying, well, each unit isn't really just one aircraft. It's actually a whole squadron, and they're kind of generating sorties and cycling on and off station. But that just gets a little bit more abstract than I wanted to do within this game. So we are mostly leaving the land-based air out of this. The carriers do have their aircraft units, and that's what's going to play the decisive role in this battle in our game. So I'm just getting the replay of what you've done here, AJ, and I see that you are coming down Iron Bottom Sound here. I'm hoping that I can I can make that live up to its name.
I hope so too, with your own ships.
And we are, I'll say, so I'm going to go ahead and do my turn here. We're just about at 9 o'clock now, and since I'm the bottom half of the turn, this will be the end of turn 4. I think when I finish my turn here, that's probably going to be a good stopping point for our live session here tonight. So after I'm done moving, we'll do a quick wrap up and set the stage for next time.
Sounds good.
Yeah, in the actual aftermath of the evacuation, there were very few of about 11,000 were taken off the island. Very few actually returned to combat status. They were in such poor physical condition. A number of them died during the journey, and none of them were physically fit enough to re-enter active combat. Which isn't to say that the Japanese should have left them to die, but it was the great book on Guadalcanal called Starvation Island from Eric Hamble's work is a pretty stark representation of just the kinds of privations the Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal suffered.
Yeah, I think it may be surprising to some folks. I know it kind of was to me when I first started reading about Guadalcanal, is that given what we know about, events later in the war where, these poor Japanese garrisons are basically just left to wither on the vine and die and told to defend to the last man and, thank you for your service. Good luck. Have a nice day. And it's almost surprising to think, in the beginning of the war here, that the Japanese would bother to even mount a rescue operation for these guys. But, I think they're looking at it from the point of view of the high command of thinking like, if we can save them, if we can get them out of there, we can use them again at some other point later in the war or in a different theater or rehabilitate them. So that's certainly the goal, even if, they're probably not too concerned about the comfort of the individual Japanese soldier, unfortunately. But from a practical point of view, it may have been worth it for them in their point of view to launch this operation and save those precious ground forces for another campaign.
Yeah,
which is no endorsement to the Navy leaving the Marines high and dry at the beginning of the campaign.
There we go. I knew we had to get in that shot.
Right. The Japanese, by December and January, they have made the decision, their high command has made the decision to prioritize New Guinea and their forces there and their defensive line there, rather than overstretch themselves, as they really had been doing in Guadalcanal.
So for the viewers who are watching what's going on here, they're starting to see where these Japanese units are coming from and who's there and what they're doing, and we're setting up something. I'm not going to say what, AJ, but
well, I see you have several votes to flee to the interior of the island.
I do see that. Yeah. Yeah, so, it looks like
I'm not sure if should I listen to the audience and should I send troops to the interior now? I'm not sure.
I'm reaching the point where I've got to make a decision one way or the other, because depending on which way I go, I'm either going to give you a chance to catch up, especially to my tail end Charlie here, the last guy on the road. You keep catching him at the end, so
they might be a goner.
It's getting to the point where they're going to have to either move a little faster, get on down the road, or head for the jungle and see if they can just evade you outright. But let's see, I think I've moved everybody that I need to, so I think I'm going to go ahead and hit the end turn here, so this is where it's going to save it. But I think for tonight, we'll go ahead and call it right here. And thank everybody for coming to watch. This was good fun. AJ, I'm excited to see what's going on here. I think we had a good build up in the first few turns here, and we're setting up something exciting for the middle parts.
I think so. I still don't know where your fleet is, so I mean that'll definitely be a mystery. I see some of them. I don't know. Could you have some other elsewhere? I guess I'll find out.
But as I said, we will go ahead, and AJ and I are going to keep playing, maybe not tonight, but in the next day or two, we're going to play probably turns 5 through, say, 8 or 9, and then we're going to go ahead and plan to do the final 3 turns, 3 or 4, on our next live session. And everybody who wants to see what happens in this game and who gets bragging rights between the Navy and the Army can make plans to show up then. We will advertise that again as we did this, so we'll give everybody a heads up about when that's going to be and give you plenty of advance notice. AJ, do you want to say something real quick before we go about events at your museum?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank you very much and thank the Naval War College Museum so much for hosting this. And then we do have the Army-Navy rivalry. The Army is better, but we are all part of the same family, so it really is an honor being here. And so, yes, I work for the National Museum of the United States Army as the Education Specialist Lead Contractor, and we are a brand new museum in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Please come and see us. We are closed right now because of COVID restrictions, but we will be open soon, and we would love to welcome any visitors to our museum. We also are offering free educational programs online at our website. If you just check out the link in the description, it will take you to the event page, and if you're interested in book talks or virtual field trips, we are offering all of that. So hopefully we'll see you sometime at one of our events.
Great. Well, thanks very much for playing, AJ, and agreeing to take me on again here. As we said, this is your second go around in these programs.
That's right.
And you did. I'm very mindful of the fact that you beat us last time in the American Revolutionary War sailing game. So honor is on the line here. I'm going to have to see if I can do better this time around. Thank you very much, Mark, for joining us and adding your insight and commentary too. That was really, really a nice addition to this. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Ralph. My pleasure.
All right, we'll go ahead and end the broadcast. And thank you, everyone, again for listening and watching. And check out our social media sites for the updates, and our YouTube pages where we'll post the next few turns of this. So look for the continuation of the game there. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a good night. We will see you again soon.